Well, thank you for joining us. We have a very exciting event. I don't know whether to call it this morning or today or whatever because we're coming to you from all over the world. So the name of the event is Restart of the Iran Nuclear Talks. It's a panel discussion. Uh, and we have four guests who are going to offer their thoughts and their expertise. They will be offering them, of course, as individuals and not as representatives of any institution to which they belong. Um, and this is a very good time for this sort of a discussion because, as we all know, the Iranian nuclear talks are scheduled to resume very shortly at the beginning of next week. And well, it's an issue of global significance, and we're very happy to be hosting it here at the Shingetsu news agency. Our four guests are, in the order in which they were advertised in our poster, Arhama Siddiqa Altaf. She is a research fellow of the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad, Pakistan, and she is, to my knowledge, joining us from Islamabad today. So thank you for joining us, Arhama. Our second guest is coming from a whole other side of the world, Scott McCann. He's a junior foreign policy fellow from the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C., USA. Thank you, Scott, for joining us.
Thank you.
And then our person who from actually Iran itself is Mohammad Javad Mousavizadeh. And I should note that he's really kind of the real organizer of this event. He's the one who got in contact with all of the guests and has been very enthusiastic in putting this together. So he's a researcher and journalist, freelance, and he is coming to us from Mashhad, Iran. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Penn.
And finally, among the panelists, we have Mohammad Abdul Basit. He is a freelance political scientist and journalist, and he is coming to us today from Lahore, Pakistan. Thank you, Mohammed, for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
And I myself, I'm Michael Penn. I'm president of the Shingetsu news agency. I'll just be here as a questioner and facilitator. I will not be giving my own opinions this time. Uh, but I'm coming to you from Tokyo, Japan. So we really are quite worldwide in our event today. Well, we have about an hour and a half scheduled for this discussion, but we have lots of ground to cover and four different opinions to hear. So basically, the way that I'd like to conduct this is I'm going to start off by asking the panelists a question, and then I will answer follow. I will ask follow-up questions. However, to the panelists, after everybody's had at least one chance to talk, feel free if you want to jump in to ask one of the other panelists about something, or to dispute something, or to agree with something. After basically everybody's had one chance, then feel free to take the initiative if you feel that there's something you really want to say. Okay, so let's start with the first question, going to Arhama, but it's really going to everybody. So, as we move into these very important negotiations, what do you see as the main factor that will determine the success or failure of this new round of Iranian nuclear talks? That's to you, Arhama.
Thank you, Michael. So I believe this is the seventh round, and I believe that the determining factor this time around is how much of a concrete assurance the US can give to Iran, or how much of concrete assurance can Iran get that nobody would back out of the JCPOA deal if it does come back on the table. Because as you know, the Iran economy is in a very bad position. They were pretty much the second epicenter in the region after China in terms of COVID. Their economy has been heavily affected by the sanctions, and so Iran is looking for a way out of the sanctions as well. But that said, Iran is also in a stronger position than it was previously, considering that number one, we have the comprehensive strategic pact with China on the 27th of March this year, So, and Iran is officially part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, Iran is slightly coming from a stronger position. And then, in terms of JCPOA, by I think 2025, some restrictions will have ended anyways, and by 2030, that's termination day, to my knowledge. So, the sanctions would have lifted anyway. So, if Iran also has that position that if it can last out till 2030, um, it is good to go. So if you look at the positioning wise, Iran is in a slightly stronger position, but given that the sanctions of the economy have left detrimental effects, they would want to reach some sort of negotiation, um, but they would also want a concrete assurance and a concrete backing that nobody would, the deal would not collapse all of a sudden, it would not be unstable. And given past history of say, the US and other areas as well, say for example the Palestinian issue where it did curb funding to UNRWA in Trump's time. So they come from a very shaky background of trust. So the main thing would be a concrete assurance that would put the deal on the table and ensure that it stays there. But for now, nothing can really be said as of now how the Vienna talks will go. But I feel that this time around, Iran is in a slightly stronger position at the negotiating table.
Okay, excellent. Well, then I throw this question to the second of our panelists, which is Scott McCann in Washington, D.C. And first of all, why don't you say the degree to which you sort of agreed with what's just been said, and then go ahead with the comments which you would have that would be above and beyond that.
All right, and thank you, Michael, for hosting, and SNA for, hosting this panel in general. So to the response of, the previous answer about Iran being in a slightly stronger position, I'm actually going to cover that sort of in what my answer was going to be regardless. Okay. So the way I see it, there's probably three factors that are going to impact the United States when it comes into this, renegotiation. The first being domestic politics. Right now, the Biden administration has to deal with what it sees its political capital being, and on top of that, what it sees its political will to rejoin the deal. One of the recent developments was that while the Democrats hold a very thin margin in Congress presently, we are now entering into the midterm election season. We're less than a year away from that. And traditionally, the sitting president's party loses seats. And so, if they lose the Senate, that means they lose the majority. So that's gonna cause some issues. And sort of a signal of what may to become is that the state of Virginia just had a governor race, and Joe Biden won the state of Virginia in his presidential election. In the most recent governor's election, all but 6 counties went for the Republican candidate. And every county shifted right to some degree, even the counties that the Democratic candidate won. And for people that were Joe Biden voters that then either highly considered voting for the Republican candidate or did vote for the Republican candidate, their message is that the Democratic Party is not representing their economic benefits, and that there's a serious lack of unity within the Democratic Party. and hope there is some thought that a win in the foreign policy realm may help Joe Biden's standing, but at the same time, if people are worried about the economy, there's not much to say that that a foreign policy victory would do much to sort of shift their thought. So Joe Biden's going to have to deal with, does he have the political will to re-enter the deal? And that's going to become particularly important with the sanctions wall that the former Trump administration built when it left the deal, because it imposed extra sanctions on top of the ones that it reimposed from prior to the agreement. And it did so in a way that it classified numerous people and entities as either violating human rights or funding terrorism, which means that Joe Biden's going to have to tell the American people that he thinks that these people or entities are not engaging in that activity, so that he can lift those sanctions and then re-enter the deal. And that's going to become problematic when he's worried about what's going to happen in the midterms. Now, the second factor is going to be, can both sides decide to, try to abandon the idea of who has leverage and focus more on trust building? And this goes back to, the previous answer of Iran may be in a slightly stronger position when it comes to their broader expanding relationship with China. They did respond to the Trump administration's maximum pressure effort with maximum resistance. So they're building, their sort of thought that they can resist what the U.S. would put in place. And the Biden administration is thinking that the sanctions are actually hurting Iran's economy, and that would force them back to the table. So both sides need to think about maybe abandoning this leverage talk and thinking about maybe moving towards a trust building effort, so that maybe they can have some sort of extended time period of low tensions and then work from there. Finally is going to be the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, which was instituted in Congress, and it requires that Congress has some review period on when the JCPOA was enacted, but the language in there also suggests that if there was going to be any substantial alteration of the JCPOA, which you would expect would be needed given the state of reality now, that Congress would then also have the ability to review anything that was altered in the original JCPOA. And language also suggests that any other deal, meaning if there was going to be a JCPOA 2.0, Congress would also have the ability to review that, and that becomes problematic for an administration that is likely about to lose the very thin margin of majority that it has currently. So those are the three factors that I see fitting into this.
Okay, thank you very much. Rather comprehensive. Moving on to our third speaker and our original organizer, Mohammad Javad Mousavizadeh. Again, I'd like to urge all of the speakers to make sure that when they speak, they're looking directly towards the camera eye so that we're making eye contact with the audience. All right, Mohammad, it's to you.
Hi, Mr. Penn. The same question?
Yes.
Yes. If you agree, I wanna to express the abbreviated history of deal. In 2015, Iran and major world powers signed the agreement, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. But after that, Trump, in May 2018, withdrew the USA from the deal and imposed crippling sanctions against Iran's economy and reduced Iran's income from oil export and trading with international trading with global community, and Iran's currency real has lost its value about 60%. But after winning of Joe Biden in USA presidential election, made a hope for reviving the deal. But we know that Mr. Biden's advisors believe that the deal, the withdrawal from the deal was a big mistake because the deal was working. And we have, unfortunately, in the previous 6 rounds in Vienna talks in Vienna, have created a little goodwill to revive Iran nuclear deal. And there are many dissidents to revive Iran nuclear deal, and we have some challenges in this road. One challenge is related to travel of Rafael Grossi to Iran, Director General of IAEA. As you know, he criticized Iran for limiting access to Iran's nuclear sites and activity. And it amounts to a bad signal before the negotiations in Vienna. And another challenge it is who takes first step. President Biden says that Iran must back to its commitments, and then U.S. will lift all sanctions against Iran. But Iranian officials in another side said the removing both nuclear and non-nuclear sanctions is precondition and necessary for backing our nuclear obligations. But I believe two sides should take their steps at the same time. And it is possible by delicate negotiations. As you know, Iranian former Foreign Minister Mohammad suggested before a synchronized model to revive a deal. And another challenge is, according to some reports, some Western countries are eager to discuss about Iran's missile program and Iran's activity in the region, Middle East, but it is a red line of Iran's government, and it is a big challenge in the subsequent negotiations in Vienna. And another challenge is in neo-Iran demand about guarantee. Iran wants guarantee that next U.S. administration will honor the JCPOA deal. As you know, Trump withdrew U.S. from the deal, and Iran wants a guarantee. And Mr. Biden is hamstrung to make such a guarantee because would need ratify it by Senate, and it is unthinkable at this time. And another challenge is Israel and other options against Iran. As you know, if diplomacy fails, some say war begins. Israel is dissident and disagree with negotiations, and Iran must reach a deal before a war is very bad, very bad situation for all countries in the Middle East. And Republican in the USA and hardliner, some Republican in USA and hardliner in Israel say that USA and Biden administration must establish fear in Iranian leaders that American threat is credible, and they have other options on the table against Iran in these regards.
Okay, thank you very much for those opening comments. And we move to our fourth and final panelist to handle that same question. So the question, of course, is what, Abdul Basit, do you see as the main factors that will guarantee either the success or failure of these talks?
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me here. I have listened to Arhama and Scott and Jawad, and they have made excellent points. I would continue with what Arhama and Jawad gave. One of their things that one of the determining factors would be that Iran would be asking for guarantees. So there are basically three conditions for Iran that it looks to return to the talks. Number one, Iran wants USA to admit its wrongdoings of withdrawing unilaterally from the deal. Number two, Iran wants the economic sanctions, relief from the economic sanctions that it is passing through. And number third, most importantly, Iran wants an offer like that which admits a guarantee that the next US administration or even Biden, they would not leave such deals unilaterally, because it basically lose the trust of the big power that is the main part of the P5+1 in this agreement. So if you people are interested in listening to stories, I would like to begin with a story. I read Stephen Walt making an analogy of Iran deal with the start of the Soviet Union rise of power. So basically, if we go back, suppose this is the year 1948, and Joseph Stalin makes an offer that if United States or some big power doesn't make sanctions on its country, and Joseph Stalin also made an offer that the United Nations can come and make a check on its nuclear program. So would the United States want to remain in this deal or not? Definitely it would. So, but the point is that the Trump withdrawal was basically a big blunder, in my opinion, to withdraw from this pact, because it was in the favor of United States. Iran has now, after United States withdrew from the pact, Iran has declared producing of 55 pounds of uranium with 60% purity. The requirement for the nuclear bomb is 90%, but it's very close. 60% is a huge amount. For nuclear reactors for energy, the requirement is only 3 to 4%. So Iran is very close now. Before Trump's withdrawal, Iran followed the limits of JCPOA. They kept it about a year from the bomb making, or reaching the point where it can make the bomb. But now the time has reduced to 3 weeks to a few months. So Iran is basically, America has pushed Iran close to making itself a nuclear power. So one thing that I would like to add is this, that the sudden withdrawal of USA under the Trump presidency was that America has lost its soft power in Iran. There is a joke that in Middle East, the governments are basically pro-USA, but their people do not like the USA. I would like Jawad to comment on that, but in Iran, it's the opposite. The government is not pro-USA, but the public is basically more acceptable for the USA. But what USA did, it made the hardliners in the Iran to have nationalist policies, and they would ultimately benefit the Iranian regime. So I would like this I would like to quote John Mearsheimer that he says that there is no evidence, and actually IAEA has also said that there is no evidence that Iran has making progress in the nuclear power security because it's having a good check on it. And Mearsheimer says that there is no evidence that Iran is likely to capitulate to American demands. If anything, the historical record demonstrates that great powers can inflict enormous punishment on their adversaries with blockade sieges and bombing campaigns. And yet, the pain rarely causes target states to surrender. Historically, when America made its invasion into Iraq and killed almost 1 lakh people, it did not make Saddam submit to the hard policies of USA, but make the nationalism arise in Iraq. So basically, what US is doing is not going to benefit it in the long term, even if it makes if hard policies make Iran come for a few months or a year, it would be hard for it in the long run.
All right, great. So now basically we're moving into what we may call a new section of this talk. No longer are we going to basically go in order around the speakers. Essentially, I'm going to ask or pose some questions, and the speakers can decide that they want to jump in and to answer it, or they can just sit back and not answer it. And the order is completely random. It's basically whoever is more, aggressive and saying, "Hey, I want to take that question." So if this is something you want to jump on, feel free to do it. And if it isn't, then just lean back and we'll let the discussion flow as it does. The next question I want to pose to the panel is how important is it for the respective regimes that these talks be a success? So how important is it for the new government of Ebrahim Raisi in Iran, and how important is it for Joe Biden in the United States that there is a deal, that there is success? Is the level of importance to the two governments equal or not? So I throw that out to the panel. Does anybody want to comment on that? Okay, go ahead, Arhama.
Yeah. So first, in terms of the question you asked, both governments do want at some level to have a for the deal to be successful, because like I mentioned previously and Scott mentioned, domestically Biden also needs if the JCPOA is a success, that will give Biden a boost, President Biden a boost, and then again for the Iran economy, and in terms of especially the health sector in Iran, which has been devastated by COVID, no less, and also because of the sanctions, because while Iran does produce most of its the basic medicines, it relies on imports. And even though sanctions are not supposed to cover the health economy, the countries which produce medicines do not really want to, deal with the sanctions because it's a long procedure. So Iran both countries somewhat want the deal to be a success. But saying that said, Iran has also sort of learned to circumvent around the sanctions. I'll give an example. In Pakistan, for example, this year, Iran and Pakistan opened border markets along the border. 3 of the border markets and 3 more are in the line. So through barter system, Iran is increasing its trade. I mentioned China, the China deal. So Iran is officially part of the BRI now. And Iran has also played smart with the Taliban in Afghanistan, where previously the Iran government and Taliban were on odds. They have been engaging with the Taliban this time around. So technically, they have been engaging with their neighbors, and they have continued increasing in engagement with Russia as well. So Iran has somewhat learned to circumvent around the sanctions. So at this point, US would need it more than Iran, because Iran has learned to, when something comes at you for a long time, you learn to deal with it somehow. Secondly, and I wanted to mention also, I think the international community has also realized that the sanctions are a bit more than they should have been originally, because even the UN has been using the term that there has been an over-compliance with the sanctions health-wise, because the UN has also said, I think 2-3 weeks ago, that there needs to be some sanction relief because it's affecting especially the children in Iran. So at this point, yes, both countries do need it, but the US needs the deal to take place, a concrete deal. All the while, Iran would need a concrete assurance from the US that this deal will not be backtracked. But right now, at some level, they both require it, but US more than Iran.
Okay. Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd like to offer some thoughts. I think that the answer is sort of complicated in the fact that I think success of the deal would matter more to Iran, but the failure to get it done would be more detrimental to the Biden administration, and I'll elaborate. The reason I think that the success of the deal is more important to Iran is because of the sanctions that are in place. They're dealing with a high COVID rate, and because of the nervousness of dealing with Iranian institutions and what that can do as far as a company, say from Europe, trying to engage in business practices with Iran, and whether or not they would face sanctions from the U.S. as a result. If the deal is successful and those sanctions are lifted, then Iran has much more ability to get back into European markets. European investors would then be able to put more money into Iran. Even with the deal being revived, there are other sanctions acts that prohibit American companies from engaging in business practices with Iranian companies. So the benefit to the United States would be somewhat limited. However, if the Biden administration puts in a lot of effort to try to revive the deal, and then it doesn't, and there's no success in that, then the Biden administration is looking at compounding factors, and by that I mean, while the majority of the American population believes pulling out of Afghanistan was the correct move, it was an optical disaster as far as how it happened and the process, and many people have expressed that concern. And so if reviving the deal was to then fail, then the Biden administration is dealing with another foreign policy loss, at least optically, when they're then heading into midterms and the majority of the population doesn't think that the Democratic Party has a unified message or that they're delivering domestically. So I think, in that regard, the success of the deal is more important to Iran, but the failure of these negotiations would be more detrimental to the Biden administration.
Okay, anybody want to jump in on that, or do I want to move on to the next question?
Yeah, Scott raised a very good point. The failure of this deal would be very detrimental to the US. If we see it as the sanctions relief from Iran, it would obviously be good for Iran, but the failure would mean that a nuclear proliferation era is back, and that would be very dangerous for this region, especially the Middle East, because if Iran becomes a nuclear power, the perceived threat to the Saudi Arabia, that would mean a lot, and that would mean some other proxy wars in that region.
Okay. Well, let me pose the next question. As far as I could tell, and I think this is kind of a I don't know, something that's a standard thought, is that the first Iran nuclear deal worked. There was no problem with it. Essentially, it was negotiated over many years, quite extensively. And then once the deal was signed, by all accounts, the Iranians were keeping their side of the deal, and it essentially was a success. But then when the Trump administration came to power, for reasons which don't seem to have anything to do with Iranian compliance, they pulled out. So what actually needs to be negotiated? Well, why shouldn't the deal that was negotiated and signed in 2015 just be reinstituted? Why are we back at the negotiating table? Why doesn't we just say, okay, that was a mistake, we shouldn't have pulled out, we want to get back to a nuclear deal, let's just go back to the terms which we had before? And if that isn't possible, how much change really needs to be made to the agreement? Are they major changes that need to be made, or are they relatively minor just because the situation has changed a little bit?
I guess I'll lead off on this one. I believe one of the problems now is that the language in the original deal does express that that no administration can allow for proliferation. And that the deal itself does in no way allows for horizontal proliferation. While I can agree that the Trump administration should have not pulled out of the agreement, and that there was an error to do so, one of the concerns that I would have with just rejoining the agreement is that, from at least the way I read the language, and mind you, I'm not an attorney, if the two sides were to rejoin the agreement, say they did it on Monday, Iran would be in violation of the deal because they have extended their enrichment to 60%, which is well above, I believe it's 3.2% that is allowed in the deal itself. Well, then that would enact a review by Congress, which could then eliminate the deal in entirety. And the language in the deal also states that because sanctions on Iran are put forth by Congress, that the deal itself in no way entirely eliminates sanctions on Iran, as that would be the purview of Congress because they put the sanctions in place to begin with. So I think one of the problems with just joining the deal is that you have to find a way to rejoin the deal so that when both parties are back in the deal, everyone's in compliance, and that there's no argument for immediately saying, okay, we're back in the deal. By the way, you're violating the deal, so now this is over. The other issue is that when it comes to proliferation, the Iranian institutions that govern nuclear expansion is that the lessons that they have learned from enriching the 60% can't be unlearned. So now you have to consider what do you do to address the knowledge base that they have acquired over the last year and a half.
Okay, very good. Anybody else want to comment on this or let it go?
Scott, I have a comment. You said that if that deal is revived, Iran has already got against it. But as far as I remember, there was a clause in that agreement that if one of the parties partially or completely backtracks from the agreement, the other party can go against it, in simple words. So what happened in 2018, Trump did do it first, and after that, Iran started to enrich its nuclear uranium-235. So basically, it was first by the U.S. failure of the foreign policy that led Iran to enriching its uranium.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Was that a question? I had a little trouble hearing all of it.
Yeah, I was just differing from you that it is not Iran that went first against the JCPOA. There was a clause in that agreement that if one of the parties partially or completely backtracks, that agreement would not be enforced completely. So it was basically first America that went against it and not Iran, because IAEA and other such organizations under UN were saying that if Iran had not enriched uranium during that period.
Yes, and let me clarify, when I was speaking about the deal itself, I was also referring to the Iran Nuclear Agreement Act, Review Act, which was put forth by Congress, that says that they get to review any deal which would include the JCPOA or anything that would come after the deal. And so, and the president has to issue a report to Congress verifying that Iran was in compliance. And so that becomes an issue if both parties would be to just rejoin right away, because Iran would not be in compliance. And so the president wouldn't be able to issue that statement to Congress. Plus, the Review Act also states that Congress would have the ability to review any substantial alterations to the language in the deal. So that goes back to the original question of, why or what's to be done about altering the deal, or whether or not it would need to be altered, is that becomes a little difficult, because any alteration to the deal would have to, in theory, would have to be reviewed by Congress. Now, the Review Act doesn't lay out what substantial alteration means, so there could be some argument about if they rejoined the deal and they're working back into compliance together, whether or not Congress would have the ability to review it. But given that the president's party does not have a large majority in either House of Congress, it would be hard pressed to think that Congress would just ignore that there in the Review Act there seems to be some level of review granted to them.
Okay.
Mr. Penn, I have a question
Sure.
from Scott.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. After defeat in Afghanistan for United States, I know President Biden need a victory in the Middle East, and it would be restoring JCPOA. But the next U.S. administration and next president of the U.S. could disappear the deal by a stroke of a pen. And Iran wants a guarantee, a firm guarantee. Do you think it is logical, Iran's demand, or not?
I do not think that having such a demand for guaranteeing the behavior of a subsequent administration is a rational ask. I say that because we are a democratic society that votes for many different people, and it doesn't just mean the president. That goes to all of our members of Congress that send a message, about the direction of how the American people want the administration to behave. With that said, I believe there are some options that could be explored to make it costly for the United States to pull out of the deal again, the way the Trump administration pulled out in 2018. And I think that's probably a more beneficial path to explore together, is not guarantee that the administration or the next administration won't pull out the deal, but to put something in place that makes it detrimental or costly for doing so. And in practice, that would sort of create a guarantee without a verbal guarantee, which the president just can't offer.
Yeah, I'd like to throw that to the rest of the panel. If Iran wants some guarantee about the behavior of future U.S. presidents, I have no idea what that would be, what that could be, because the next U.S. president could very well be Donald Trump again, or somebody of a similar point of view. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution or government which prevents a president from overturning the decisions of previous presidents. I don't think the United States is unique in this. I think any government essentially can overturn the policies of a previous administration. So what is Iran talking about? What is the Raisi administration talking about when they're talking about a guarantee of what future U.S. leaders are going to do? It doesn't sound like. And as for making the costs high, as Scott McCann has suggested, well, they may be high costs in terms of United States' diplomatic prestige around the world, but that doesn't really mean much for a Donald Trump type figure, because he's playing to a very domestic nationalist audience who may actually enjoy seeing the rest of the world get upset at the United States. So what kind of guarantee could we possibly be talking about, or that the Iranians are seeking here?
I believe so. Iran should waive its demand and should think about unfreeze its foreign assets that blocked in Japan and South Korea and other countries, and export its oil legally again, because Iran has a catastrophic economic situation, and the new administration in Iran needs definitely to the achievement in Vienna talks. I know that Trump or Republican believe that if Democrats rejoin to the deal, they kill JCPOA again in 2024. And I believe that such a guarantee by Biden administration is unthinkable. But Iranian demands about guarantee can give them upper hand in the negotiation, and it amount to bargaining chips in the negotiations in Vienna, not more.
Okay.
I would like to add that as far as I have read different analysts, most of them are saying that America would anyway not be giving any such kind of guarantee that the upcoming regimes would not backtrack from it. Because it's a matter of national interest for the United States, and if US does something what Trump did, it would be very catastrophic for the nuclear non-proliferation. And that would be a very big threat to the US. So I don't think that US would anyways be giving any kind of guarantee, like other regimes would not backtrack from it.
Okay. Well, I guess this would be a good place to bring in the Europeans or the Japanese or other parties to the agreement. Do they mean anything? I mean, last time when the Trump administration pulled out, you heard a lot of complaining from Europe, and they were supposedly not happy about it, and they probably weren't. But at the end of the day, they didn't do anything. Is this going to continue, that basically that the Europeans and the other parties are essentially not major factors, or is it possible that they might put their foot down and say, if a future American administration pulled out again for not very good reasons, would they say, well, we're going to continue to back the Iranians on this? So is this possible, or is it essentially because the Europeans and the United States are allies that eventually they'll fall in line whether or not they really agree with the U.S. policy?
So I believe that yes, there is a realization within Europe that there has been that there has to be a lessening in the sanctions, as I mentioned before. But because they are very strong allies of the US, they won't put their, as you said, they won't put their foot down anytime soon. And in all likelihood, I believe the first 6 talks before the Raisi government came into power, they were apparently they have been cited as a golden opportunity for the Biden administration, which he forwent, because the Raisi government has taken up a more hardliner stance than the previous government. And also the person who is leading the talks this time around is a different person, Deputy Foreign Minister, and he has very vocally said that he wants a concrete assurance, a guarantee, right? So with Iran's hardliner stance, in one place, Europe does realize it to an extent, to a large extent, that there is an over-compliance with sanctions, because Europe is also losing out on trading opportunities in Iran because of these sanctions, because and honestly, if Iran is part of the BRI, I keep stressing on the BRI a lot, because for us, Pakistan, PPEC has become a sort of a link that will take us out, hopefully take us out of this fiscal deficit. Similarly for Iran, so for Pakistan and the BRI, all these Gulf countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia and all, they're looking for opportunities within the BRI right now because this geographical location, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan are placed in, is full of opportunities. So European countries are losing out because of this. And other countries like Central Asian states and China, for example, have somewhat cashed in on the opportunities as well. And so the bigger problem will be for the European companies, right, countries right now. But in all likelihood, they won't be putting down their foot anytime soon in face of the US sanctions. But maybe in the long term, they would be forced to do so.
Okay. Anybody else want to jump in on the allies? Are they worth talking about? Are they are they a factor we need to be considering?
I'd also like to add that it's all about economics at the end of the day. Now, the world has, it's only about economics. So, for example, the US withdrew from, and the US's policy is more about containment of China now. Iran does not really take that priority anymore. So, like for example, we saw the AUKUS alignment on 16th of September, and we've also seen a new quad being formed in with India, UAE, Israel, and the US. And so basically, the US, again, it's all about economic opportunities and investment. And so again, the European countries and honestly any country in the world will be looking at how much economic opportunities they have from this, and that will be the decision maker at the end of the day.
Okay, well, Arhama raises another issue which I was actually going to get to a little bit later, which is the China factor. To what extent, if at all, does China play into this by the fact that the United States is now trying to execute a sort of pivot to the Pacific? It's now sort of identifying China as sort of the rival of most concern. You could argue that the end of the Afghanistan war was part of a strategic sort of shift of the United States trying to kind of pull out some of its mess that is created in that region to shift more of its resources to the Pacific region. Does this factor play in at all in the Iranian nuclear talks, or is it just not a big enough issue to really affect them?
I think the China question is a pretty interesting dynamic because, as was mentioned, the U.S. is engaging in what they're referring to as strategic competition with China, and I think that when we're talking about a national security strategy, one of the faults that the U.S. has had in the past is that they've not always been aligned across all of their regions. Well, the China issue comes into the nuclear agreement in that right now China is offering lifelines to Iran and expanding their relationship in the face of the U.S. imposing sanctions and leaving the JCPOA. So if the United States is focused on a strategic competition with China, then it would be smart for them to not help China build a counter sort of world order to what the U.S. refers to as the world order as we see it currently. So having a unified strategy to understand that China does play into the Iran nuclear deal question certainly becomes very important. And with that, Iran recently hosted a regional summit for them to deal with what was going on in Afghanistan after the U.S. pull out, and China was invited as a observer, and they attended virtually, if I'm not mistaken, while the U.S. was, blocked out of that conversation. So the relationship with Iran and China is certainly there, and it's certainly growing. So I think the China question does play into the nuclear question, because the United States has to realize that Iran's not nearly as isolated as one may think, and if they aren't willing to show some flexibility and get back into the JCPOA, that Iran could permanently align itself with China, which would be counterproductive to the United States' thoughts on strategic competition with China.
Okay, anybody else want to jump in on the China factor? Okay, since we're looking... Oh, go ahead, yes.
Yes. I believe that in an agreement, if agreement will be reached, it is in all interests, all countries in the world, except for Israel. As you know, Iran and China signed a 25-year cooperation for a long time in 2021. And China now wants to restore the JCPOA because they want trade with Iran and benefit from Iran capability, but they cannot now because Iran is under banking sanctions and severe sanctions, and I think China wants to restoring the JCPOA and would benefit from it.
Okay. Anybody else want to jump in before we move on? Okay, well then let's look at some other powers, the only group that we haven't really talked about, and that's that those who might want to disrupt or to stop a deal between the United States and Iran, and the two which immediately come to my mind would be maybe Saudi Arabia and some of the Arab Gulf states who don't want good things to happen to Iran, perhaps some of their leaders, and then of course Israel. So do we need to be mindful of the role that these countries might play as sort of potential disruptors of any deal, or are they also simply they don't have enough weight to affect U.S. policy on the issue? What's your feeling?
So as far as weight is concerned, I would say Israel has substantial weight when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, because time and again the U.S. has said that it is Israel's security guarantee in the Middle East, and in fact Israel is probably its only staunch ally in the Middle East. So Israel does have the potential of disrupting the deal, but as far as Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf countries are concerned, we saw rapprochement efforts by the Gulf allies, by Saudi Arabia this year around. Iran and Saudi Arabian officials have met. Most recently, they met in the Baghdad summit, facilitated by Iraq and by Jordan. They have been making rounds of negotiations because, for example, in the war in Yemen, Saudi Arabia has suffered immensely. And again, as with every economy, COVID has detrimented a lot of all the economies around the world. It was a global crunch. Saudi Arabia is more, and also again I'll mention that the China-Iran deal has sort of raised flags in the Gulf countries as well, because and that is why Saudi Arabia is looking at increasing investment opportunities within the Gwadar area because the thing is that if as the deal with China materializes, Iran gets into a stronger position. Its ports, Chabahar port, and there are two other ports that I think the two other ports are going to be really functional, and that'll be a direct threat to the ports of UAE in terms of trade. So yes, UAE can play the role of a spoiler. We saw the Abraham Accords take place last year in August, and we have seen this new Quad formation between the UAE, Israel, and the US and India. So UAE has more of a chance to play as a spoiler, but I don't know how significant UAE is as in the Gulf as compared to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has sort of taken a back foot. It's more focused because it only has 9 years to complete its Vision 2030. So it's more focused on that at the moment, and it has been, like I mentioned, making rapprochement efforts with Iran. So not so much Saudi Arabia, but Israel and UAE can potentially be spoilers of this.
Any others think that there's could be trouble from regional powers?
I think at least from the U.S. perspective, that history certainly lends itself to believe that Israel and Saudi Arabia have significant influence on U.S. foreign policy within the region. I happen to think that is one of the things that the United States needs to get under control, and that the foreign policy of the United States needs to be to the benefit of the United States, and that it needs to spend a little less time being influenced by its regional allies. With that said, I keep going back to the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. There's also language in that act that says that in no way is an agreement on the JCPOA meant to diminish the U.S. commitment to the security of Israel. So there's significant congressional support and legal support for Israel. So separating the two interests is a little more difficult than just saying it. Saudi Arabia, I agree that Saudi Arabia seems to be taking a little bit of a back seat. Again, the Baghdad summit was mentioned, in which Iran and Saudi Arabia have come together, and they're trying to work out some of their regional issues. So there seems to be some thought that with U.S. ambiguity as far as commitment to the region, that the two countries are looking to, develop a diplomatic relationship. And at the U.S. General Assembly in September, the King had a virtual message that was read out loud about the kingdom supporting a diplomatic solution to the Iranian nuclear issue. So at least in that regard, it seems that Saudi Arabia wants a diplomatic solution, at least on the surface.
Okay. Very good.
I want to say something.
Yeah.
Yes, Israel asserts that Iran's nuclear program is at the most advanced point ever for obtaining the ability of produce of a nuclear weapon, and accelerated its plan to covert strike on Iran. I have a question from Scott or other friends. Do you think the war, if diplomacy fails, the war is good alternative, or is unthinkable?
Sorry, can you ask that?
Yeah,
again?
the question is, if the talks fail, is war a possibility, or is it not? Is it just off the table?
I mean, I can't speak for the administration and say that it's off the table. I certainly hope that war is off the table. I'm exhausted from a U.S. warfront perspective. So I think that the alternative to getting a deal done is certainly something that should be concerning. But with that said, Senator Bob Menendez, who is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, he is a Democrat that voted against the original JCPOA, but he recently wrote an op-ed that acknowledged that while he was against the original deal, he now understands that Trump pulling out of the deal created a more substantial threat to U.S. security than staying in the deal. So I think that there's some thought out there that an alternative is worse, and that they do need to figure out how to revive the deal, because that's better for U.S. security than the alternative.
Gotcha.
Okay. Well, we are getting a little. Yeah, go ahead, Mohammed.
No, I say I got it.
Okay.
I agree.
Well, we are getting a little bit close toward the end here, so I think that I do want to go back through a circular thing through all four members to give sort of the final word. And the question which I'm going to pose to our four members is, if the two sides kind of came together in the room around the table, and you were invited to give a few words of advice to the negotiators, what would you say to them? What advice would you give them as they begin these talks next week? We'll go in the opposite direction this time, starting with Mohammad Abdul Basit.
I would like them first to have cooperation instead of the big power bullying the lower power. So I would just make them sit together and talk. Like suppose in this meeting going to be held in Vienna, the United States is coming, but Iran is not going to have a meeting with its officials. So Iran will be meeting with the other 5 members, but not the USA. So that would be a big failure in this meeting that is presupposed. So without going comprehensively talking about the deal, there are minimum chances that the good results can come. Secondly, there are, as Arhama suggested, the China factor. China is having, I suppose if I'm not wrong, $400 billion of investment in Iran in the Lahore and the related area. So the Strait of Hormuz is very likely to be under control of China, with China investing in Pakistan to other areas. So this region is more likely to be in heavy control of China. So as long as China and USA do not resolve their issues, they are already going through a confrontation state with AUKUS and Quad. So that would be a significant problem in this deal. If it is not coming on the surface, behind the scenes, this might also be working. Iran would be under an influence of China, and that factor, though it cannot be much predicted as things are not coming out. So we'll have to see what goes. But at the moment, what matters is that to stop the nuclear proliferation, America needs to give some incentives to Iran. So it doesn't become a nuclear power. If America's interest lies in that thing to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power. But if America does not get a few steps back, the future would be more scary than America would be thinking at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Mohammad Javad Mousavizadeh, what advice would you give to negotiators if you're in front of them?
Okay. as you know, in chicken game between Iran and United States, Iranian people are loser, and they have very problem in life, and I advise to negotiator things to people and Iranian people that are under crippling sanctions, onerous sanctions, inhuman sanctions, and the tolerant, the high inflation in the Iran that helped their economy. And if the sanctions will be removed by Biden administration, the Iranian people have better life, and I advise just this point to negotiators, two sides, think to people.
Okay, think of the people. I like that. As a Democrat myself, I always think that we need to prioritize the interests of general populations. Scott McCann, this is to you. What's they turn to you, the negotiators turn to you at the beginning of the event and say, what's your advice? What do you tell them?
So first, I'm going to concur with Mohammed's think of the people advice. I do believe that should be a central focus. As far as speaking directly to the delegations, I would say that one of the main factors that I would advise them to do is abandon their preconditions. The Iranian side needs to abandon the idea of being guaranteed that the next administration won't pull out of the deal, because the people sitting at the table can't make that promise. To the Americans, I would say that you need to abandon the idea of trying to fit everything inside this negotiation. The negotiation is about nuclear proliferation, and that's where it needs to stay. Don't bring in conversations about human rights or terrorist activities or malign activity throughout the region as the U.S. sees it, and focus on the issue at hand, which is the nuclear issue. And from there, just commit to having direct conversations with each other. I think that one of the most beneficial things that could come out of the new round of negotiations would be that even if they can't solve their differences at this time, to agree to going back to having direct communication with each other so that the conversation can continue and that they can build a relationship and start expanding trust building and abandon their points of their perceived leverage and move forward in a respectable manner.
Okay, excellent. And our final word on this subject comes from Arhama Siddiqa Altaf. What is your advice to the negotiators?
So the problem with being the last speaker is that everything has already been said, and I agree with all three of them, especially with what Scott said. The thing is, trust once lost is really hard to build, but then direct communication is the best way to go forward. And also, both sides need to put humanity at the forefront. Again, because the situation in Iran is devastating, and as Scott mentioned, that the focus, if it's on nuclear, then the focus should be on nuclear alone. Don't bring in other factors as well. And because humanity knows no boundaries, so keep the focus on the people. reach a compromise and directly talk to each other. Don't bring in other players and parties, because then that leads to spoilers, and that makes all the difference in breakthroughs.
Okay, and before I spin into the wrap up here, is there any final thing which anybody wants to say that's been on their mind, but they haven't had a chance to jump in on yet?
Yeah, I would like to ask Mohammad Jawad, what are the sentiments of the Iranian population at the moment regarding this?
Did you catch the question? He's asking what are the sentiments of the Iranian people about these negotiations? How do they feel? How do the Iranian people feel about these negotiations?
Okay, Iranian people after Iran Revolution 1979 always have been under sanctions and other problems, and they have hope to this discussion in the Vienna, in talks in Vienna, and because they have very problem in this situation, high food price, high inflation in Iran. But Iran's new administration under Ibrahim Raisi is a hardliner and conservative, and some people have not hope to revive the JCPOA by this administration. In the past, in the period of the Rouhani administration and Mousavizadeh, Iranian negotiators were closer to American negotiator, Mr. Zarif, Mr. Abbas Araghchi. They have experience to negotiate with American in 2015. But now Iranian have a hardliner negotiator, Mr. Bagheri Kani, Deputy Foreign Minister, is head of negotiation team of Iran in the Vienna talks, and he is a strong opponent of the JCPOA and deal, and they have a strong position in these talks, and the people just watch to TV and read the news for here's good news.
Okay. All right. Well, then that's where we'll leave it for this panel discussion. Of course, we all will watch with great interest to see what does actually happen in these negotiations. I think we all agree that the stakes for humanity are rather high, and we will hope for a peaceful resolution and some sort of agreement to be reached, which hopefully will be embraced not only by the current governments but those to come. I want to thank each of our four panelists for their excellent contributions. There was nobody hiding in the corner. Everybody came out with clear opinions on each issue, and I think it was a very productive discussion from multiple viewpoints spread all around the world. So thank you, all of you, for joining us in this panel today.